Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to do a run through, and hopefully it'll stay pretty quick, I want to keep below 10 minutes, about async await and promises. So before we get into async await, we do have to cover and talk about promises, and what are promises is probably the best way to start. Now I'm going to keep it super high level and try not to get into any of the details because this video could actually be pretty long, but I just want to cover the brief and make sure we get a quick understanding of what async await and promises do. So promises, like I simply laid out, are a way for us to wait, and I put that in air quotes, wait for some code to complete. We could look at some basic examples. One might be, you're waiting for the user to type something, and then you want to run some code when the user comes in. That's a good use case for a promise because we're waiting for code. And the other thing, maybe if you want to write a file and then wait for that to complete, and then check maybe did that file successfully write, did the file exist? Now, in JavaScript, specifically in JavaScript, because there's async await in other languages as well, promises are a way of handling asynchronous code. That just means code that runs outside of the main thread of JavaScript or the main event loop. It uses something called the message queue, and that's going to be kind of an interesting thing, and I wish I had some drawings that I could show you, and I might try and type something out, the message queue, and that holds all the code that is waiting to run. So this code here, for example, let's just collapse up this function. We have a wait function called wait, and then it takes a parameter called then run me. And this code is going to execute synchronously. So when I go down here and I call wait and I pass in a function, console.log, boop, I ran. This code here will run synchronously, this wait, because it's synchronous. But then inside of here, there's some asynchronous code. It's using a callback. We're going to translate it to a promise later. It's using a callback, but it's going to run asynchronously. And this code internally will actually get put onto that message queue, which means that it'll pretty much say, when I have some time, please run this code. And when I talk about time, I mean like super small amounts of time. So there's obviously different ways to run asynchronous code. The most common before promises, because promises I imagine are like number one right now in terms of commonality, are callbacks. Now I'm using a callback in here. Callback is just a passing a function, and this function is then going to be the unit of code on our message queue that's going to run later. This piece of code here, we're telling JavaScript, hey, I want to run. Just tell me when you have a microsecond, and then you can run me. And that's kind of the basis of asynchronous code. You're just telling JavaScript, I want to run something when something else happens. And in this case, it's this timeout. And in other cases, we might want to wait for user input, and we'll go through a couple of those examples today. So the first one's first. Here we have this wait, and we're going to quickly demonstrate this is a callback using set timeout. This function here is going to be pushed onto that queue, or the message queue, and it will run asynchronously. So what we're going to do is we're going to call wait synchronously, have this function say I ran, and then it will run after 1 second. So let's run that. Running, I ran. It's probably best we can show that it's asynchronous by putting a console log in this function here. I should run. There we go. Let's save that file. So when we call wait, because it's synchronous, it's going to call this and tell JavaScript, run this when you have time. And then this one here is going to say, I'm going to run right away. It's synchronous. So let's run it again. So it's going to run right away. Boop, I should run. And then it's going to wait and then say, I ran. So this 1000 here is actually a bit misleading because it's saying it's a minimum wait time for JavaScript. We're going to say at least wait 1 second before calling this. But really it's going to be, if I'm running lots of asynchronous thing and there's no time and JavaScript says there's no way I can run you at this time, it's going to wait a bit longer than a second. But it's still going to be very quick, so we won't have to really worry about that. Okay, perfect. So this here, we have a nice wait function. It's asynchronous. It's going on the message queue and saying, please run this later. That's pretty much asynchronous code. This is using a callback. But the question is promises. How do we use promises to do this exact same thing? And maybe what are promises? So promises are a way of representing this idea of saying go off and wait for something to run as an object in JavaScript. So right now we're using a callback, and a callback is just a function. We can't really say, is this done yet? Did this error? We don't really have those capabilities, and so promises are that solution. So what we're going to do is going to create a promise out of this, and then we're going to use that promise to tell, is this complete yet, or is it errored? So let's go in here. What we actually need to do is create that object, return. Instead of returning nothing, we're going to return a new promise, so new promise. And promises have this concept of resolving and rejecting. And those are our two scenarios of it was successful and it failed. Now you're going to see that that also takes a callback, because we're going to say, hey JavaScript, when we want to run something, we want to create this object to monitor whether or not something's going to complete yet, we're going to give it this callback to run. And that's going to go on our asynchronous message queue. So inside that set timeout, we're going to call that function runMe. And in here, we can say resolve. Resolve means just complete that promise, and we got to pass in I completed. Complete this promise, using this resolve function, and this will allow us to monitor, is this done yet? And then if it is done, what did it give us out? What did it return to us is the kind of way. Promises are allowing us to return values out. So no other changes to this. We're going to return, I should probably not put this in here because it'll never run. We're going to return a new promise as opposed to just running this. And we're still going to call await exactly the same. Now the other piece to promises is, of course, let's just console log this. They are an object, and that's the key, right? We're representing some sort of asynchronous code, in this case, this set timeout, as an object. So I'm going to clear my terminal here. I'm going to run it again, node index, boom, and you can see I get a promise. And a promise is that object representing it's kind of the state of that message queue, or this specific message in that queue. JavaScript, is this function that I just requested run yet? It's going to say pending, which it's not. And there's two functions we can use inside of promises to make sure we know when it's ended and when it's errored, which is then. So then says, when this promise runs, then do something. And in our case, we're just going to console.log. And what will console.log is whatever we have resolved. So resolve can be, of course, any object. It could be a function. It could be a string, a number, a more complex object. Either way, resolve is going to send us, and we're going to get that back out of this then call here. So let's run that. So we should see nothing. It's almost exactly, we just recreated almost exactly that first example where nothing's going to happen for a second. Then we're going to say I ran, because this in here it's going to run quote unquote synchronously. So we have run the runMe, which prints out I ran. And then we're going to resolve that promise saying, yep, I've completed my promise now. I've completed that piece of asynchronous code, and I've logged it in here, which says I completed. Now the other option is, of course, rejecting. Rejecting is like I have an error. So I errored. So then it won't catch it, but we have, I just kind of slipped a bit, we have a catch. Catch function does the exact same thing. It takes in some sort of parameters. Again, whatever I reject can go into here. We have error, and then we'll just console.error the error. There we go. And this catch will allow us to catch errors, and it'll say this promise ran, something happened inside that threw an exception, or I specifically rejected it, and it's going to come into our catch statement. So let's run this again. It's still going to print I ran, but then it print I errored instead of printing whatever else came through in the .then. So promises are just a way for us to monitor the asynchronous code we run, because without that, we wouldn't know when this code in here gets run. That's pretty much the gist of it. Now let's take a look at using promises. So I showed you kind of one example of how to use a promise. Using promises, we can do it two ways. One, we can create them. So we took a function that didn't use a promise, and we made it use a promise. We did some asynchronous code in here that uses callbacks. We said, let's use a promise instead, and now we could use promises. So that's one way of doing it, and I'm going to show you one more way of doing that using Node. And we're pretty much just going to write the promisify. The other way of doing it is using somebody else's code, somebody else's library that already uses promises internally. So something like inquirer. So we could do import inquirer. Make sure I spell it right. Inquirer is require. Inquirer. There we go. And the other thing we're going to bring in here is const fs or the file system. That's just from node there. Perfect. And what we'll do is, I'm just going to collapse up this code. Here, we'll do some spaces down here. We don't want to run that just yet. And we'll comment out this stuff here, because we're going to want to keep it around just as our base understanding of how promises work. And then we're going to do 2 more examples. So the first example is us writing our own promise. Now, very often, the only reason you're writing a promise is from translating some other piece of asynchronous code into something you can monitor. So fs.write file. Actually, let's read our own file. That makes a bit more sense. Read file. This is an asynchronous call, and it's going to take a path, and I just want to read actually this file, the index.js file. And what it takes here is a callback function with an error, if it errored, and then the data, or the file data, we can call it content from within that file. And hopefully I remember this all correctly. So let's console.log error and content and see what we get back. So let's clear the terminal, node, index, boom. All right, so here's our object. We have error is null. We actually have no value in the error. There's no errors, which is great. And then the content, which is a buffer. And that, of course, buffers are a lot of fun. But what I want to do is actually want to print the string version of that. So we can just say content.toString, and we can pass in the encoding UTF-8, which is the one we want to be able to read. Let's run it again. There we go. And there's our source code. So I printed out our source code. Now, this is using a callback as a form of asynchronous. So if I do some console logs down here, I can say waiting. But that'll run first, right? Boop. See, it said waiting, and then it ran and got all of our content back. So there's no real way of us monitoring when this is complete. So what we want to do is we want to create a promise out of this. And the best way to do that, like I showed you before, is new promise, and create an object from it, resolve and reject, the 2 ways we can handle promises. There we go, pass it that function, which inside of that is going to be doing our asynchronous code. And instead of doing a console log here, what we're going to say is if we have that error, we can reject. We can reject that error. Otherwise, we're just going to resolve that content. And because I'm writing it myself here, I only ever want to resolve, I don't want to resolve that buffer. I want to resolve just UTF-8. There we go. And this is going to give us an object back. So we're probably going to want to store that in a variable like reading file. And then we can print that over here and say reading file and waiting. Let's clear out this console. And then it's going to give us a promise. It's going to say, hey, I'm trying to read the file and I'm waiting. Now, of course, nothing else printed because I took out that print statement. So it just resolved and completed, and that's all that happened. But what we can do instead, here we go, is listen to, once it's finished, then we get the file content out of there. Boom, and then we can console.log, I am complete, exclamation point, and then file content. We'll print that out as well. So it's going to say, print this file content, reading file promise to see if it's pending. Then we have this waiting print, and then once it's complete, it'll print out I am complete and the file content. So let's do this, and then boom, there we go. So we got that promise that says, I'm still waiting. Then it prints I'm complete. So it completed, it ran our .then, and it printed out our file content. So that's kind of one way of using a promise. It's taking a non-monitorable or something that isn't an object, we don't know the state of it, and turning it into an object we can understand and treat as if we understand where the state of that asynchronous code. And that's us creating that. And then we can use our resolve and reject to reject if it's an error, which means we'd use, I didn't put it in here, but we'd use our .catch to catch those errors. And we use our resolve to send out and respond or return a value out to this .then function. So when this runs, then we get some value back. Great, okay, the other way of dealing with promises, so let's comment out this stuff. We don't want to run that anymore. Any of this for now. Is dealing with a promise that somebody else already wrote. Inquirer, I should have aliased something because I can't type it, has a function called prompt. And if you've never seen inquirer, you can just Google that on npm, and it's a library to like do some nice prompts in the console. It takes a couple things. So it has like type. We're just going to give it an input, and I just want to ask your name. So I think it takes name here is what we want the variable name to be called when it comes back, name. And then we want the message, so the kind of prompt. What should we call you? Question mark. There we go. Now this here is asynchronous, and it uses promises to handle that asynchronous nature and to tell us when things are complete. So first of all, we were just console log this, just to show you that it returns a promise, console.log, because promises are an object. It's really key to remember. Promises are just objects representing the state of asynchronous code. And console.log is going to allow us to view that or have a little bit of insight into what the return value, which will be a promise, is. So let's run that node index.js. Boom. Oh my gosh, it's a massive thing. So they've extended that promise a little bit. So you can see here it's a promise. It says pending, but they've extended that object, that promise, just because it's an object, right? Objects you can extend whatever you like, and they put a whole bunch of other stuff in there. But I'm just going to end that. That was a huge promise object. But unless it's a promise, so what we can do over here is say .then, and we'll just do a console.log. Once it's finished, console.log. So let's run that. Oops, that's clear. Here we go, node. So it says, what should we call you? That's our inquirer working, and I'm going to say Eric, and hit enter, and it's going to console log right over here once that's complete. And it says name, Eric. So this is a lovely little promise. I'm sure it has a .catch as well if there's errors. I'm not sure how to cause an error here, but for now, .then is sufficient. What should we call you? Bam. So if you ever want to know, what if this library returns a promise, of course you can read the documentation, but you can also just do that like I did before, console.log, and see what the return value is. Because promises, again, are just objects. This is really key to understanding async await, is that promises are just objects, and the objects just represent a state of that asynchronous code. So let's go ahead and write a function here. Get into some async await now. Function. We saw the two ways we can run or deal with promises from somebody else's library and writing our own. And now what we want to do is we want to have an async await function. We're going to call it run. We're going to run all three examples all in one. Here. So I have a function called run. Now in order for this to be an async await function, what we're going to do is going to go through what the syntax might actually be. So we're going to go return here a new promise, and this is exactly what's happening when we deal with async await. I should say exactly, and it's not exactly what's happening necessarily, but you can think of it this way. And inside of this promise is where we have all of our nice code. So we're going to run our inquirer example. Boop. Oh dear, I saved and it formatted. So there's the first one we're going to run. We're going to run inquirer. It's going to do our thing. It's going to do a console log there. Then we're going to run our read file example here, which is going to create a promise called read file from our callback. And it's going to resolve us the content. And then we just want to print that content. So let me just grab this then. There's a lot of brackets. There's a lot of brackets going on. There's our then. Lovely. And the last one was our wait function. So it's already defined, but I can just grab this code here. Boom. Wonderful. And we'll put that last. So this function run, it's not async await yet, but it just wraps the whole function body in a promise. And it's going to run through all of these functions. At the very bottom, it's going to do resolve. Right now, we're not returning anything, but if we wanted to, let's say we could return I am complete as a string. I am complete. We're going to return that. The other thing we could do is, of course, we'll have to monitor if any of these errors, so we say like .catch, we just want to reject. We want to pass on that reject up the entire string, up the entire function. And here we go, .catch, and then reject. So if any of our internal promises are errors, they all error, I want to reject them. Reject. Perfect. So in this one function run, we actually run three promises. We run our inquirer promise, our reading the file promise, and our waiting promise. Each one of these things can resolve, and each one of these things can reject. Now, I'm not getting into storing values in the resolve, that's fine. So reject, we're just passing it along. And then at the very, very end, we're going to do one resolve to say this promise is complete. and this promise, which contains 3 other promises, is complete, and then that will resolve. Now, of course, these things won't wait. We might have to do something like, hey, how many promises are there? There's 3, so let's say let count equal to 0, and we have to count how many promises resolve, but that's fine. This is getting a bit more complicated, so pretty much we can think of it this way. Actually, what we'll do here is we'll put it in this last one. That way we can guarantee that value. I'm not sure what comes in here. Console.log value, and after that value is done, we can say complete. Because this is the last promise in the queue, it'll be the last one to run, hopefully. That isn't always necessarily true, but that's fine. Okay, so I didn't call it, so let's call run. Here, so run's gonna run 3 promises. Here we go. Boop, 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 node. Blam, so it ran a bunch of them already. Oh my goodness, there was an error. One of them errored. That's great, so we got that reject. So it printed out things, it ran most of them. It's still inquire. Can I type Eric? Yeah, there's the inquire run, there's Eric. And then it ends after all 3 promises are complete. Now that was a big mess. The whole point of doing that was to say, how do we translate this into async await? Now async await wraps every function, and as soon as you declare a function async like this, it all of a sudden returns a promise. So I'm not going to do any awaits inside of here. Let's just go with get rid of these resolve and reject calls because we don't have that anymore. Get rid of the rejects. Get rid of the rejects here. Good. And then there's a bit of extra quotations here. And I want to return I am complete, which is the one we were trying to return the other time. Oh, I think doesn't seem like I am saving properly. Aha, there's a bracket. There we go. Okay, perfect. So now run is an asynchronous function. I am not returning a promise. I'm only returning a string. But if I console log in here, console.log, whatever that run returns, and I'm actually going to comment out all my other console logs because it's going to get really messy if we don't. So you'll see that just by declaring that function async, it actually returns a promise. Now here it actually gives us the value because we have the value as a constant, but if it was a variable, it would be just pending variable here. But you can see that it's just as a constant. The compiler made a bit of a guess and knew a bit more we could do, but it's just a promise. So by declaring async, this whole function now is returned as a promise, which means we can do on this, we can do .then, and we can do .catch. Because it's just a promise. It's just giving us a way to, instead of wrapping everything and doing some counting of whatever promises are internal, we can just say, put async on there, this whole thing is now a promise, and we can use .then, and we can use .catch on side of that run. And we'll use .then, we don't have to worry about catch at this point. And we'll just console.log, and this will console.log, I am complete in here. Now I'm not waiting for any of these promises, so this is just gonna run incomplete, which is what we'll see here. It'll just run, and then complete. You see it printed I am complete, which is great. Boop. It printed I am complete. Oh, I'm still rejecting in here, I think, aren't I? No, I'm not. Okay, that's good. Yeah, it's still running. Oh, I am complete. And then, oh, I am rejecting in here. Yeah, that's why it's throwing an error. Resolve. There we go. I'm complete because there's no waiting, but it returns a promise now. I just converted this function into a promise. Just, again, promises are objects representing the state of the asynchronous code that's running. Now, of course, internal to this async, the purpose of it is to make it just to look a little bit nicer when we run many promises. Because most of the time, this.then, if we wanted to run this promise after this promise, we wanted this code to wait for this code, we'd have to say inside of the .then function, then we have to call our new promise in here, which would be this one, and it'll nest just like callbacks like this. And if you want to just wait for that one and then call wait after that, it's even more code. It's even more nesting. So instead what we can do, you can use the await keyword. So let's say const. Because again, await now allows us to reach into that promise value variable and get out the return value. So before you used to see something like promise, and it was like squiggly brackets, and it might stay pending, or in our case before, it said something like I am complete as a string, like this. If we want to get that value, the I am complete, out of that promise, that's what we're going to use the await keyword for. So we're going to reach into that promise and take out that value. So in our case here, we want the values, we'll call it, just from the inquirer, and we're going to await that. So we're going to reach in, and whatever inquirer.prompt returned in the promise, we're going to reach in and grab that out. From values, similarly for reading file, this is saying I want to do a new promise. We can just await that new promise directly like this, and it's going to give us the content back directly because that's what we're resolving. That's what we're returning. So we'll get that out directly and put that in a variable, and we don't have to do this anymore. And then similarly with wait, wait doesn't actually return, oh, it does return a string. So we can get that const string equals, and then await the wait. Await the wait. And then once that's complete, I'm not going to return I am complete anymore. Let's return all three of those variables. So let's return that string. We'll return the content from the file, and we'll return the values from our prompt. So we just made these three promises look synchronous, and this whole function now returns a promise that waits for all three of these promises, assuming they don't reject. Usually when one of them rejects, it's going to throw an error, and we can handle that, but we're typically going to wait for each one of these to finish. And then we're going to return that here, and then we're going to run it, and since this is a promise, we can console.log, and whatever this return value is. So let's take a look at that. Clear. And node. It's going to call me. See, it's not printing anything yet because it's waiting for each one of these. So I could sit here forever. It's not reading the file yet. It's not running this wait at the very bottom. I'm going to call myself Eric, and then it's going to run all three. Boop. There we go. And so what we get is string I errored, which is what returned from this wait. Resolve I errored. Then we get the content of our file. At the very bottom here, we have values, which is in my name, Eric, which is what I typed in. And that's all these things, right? So await is a way to reach into a promise, because a promise is just an object, and get the value that it returned out. So pull the value out right into this values. And similarly for the content, we're doing the same thing with that await. We're reaching in, and we're getting whatever this resolve is going to be. That's going to be the value we're reaching out and pulling out into this content. And then similarly with await, reach into whatever that pulls out. This resolve here is going to be a string. Reach in and pull that out, and it's going to give us a string. And that's pretty much a basic intro to async await. It's just a wrapper for promises, or some people like to call it syntactic sugar for promises, because it really just wraps this whole thing in a promise. Everything I return here, even though it looks like I'm returning an object, it's going to be a promise of that object, which means the promise is going to contain these values. And anywhere we have a promise, we can use await. And await reaches into that promise, whatever that is, and pulls out that value, this value here. Great. So I hope that was helpful of understanding promises, understanding a little bit of asynchronous, dealing with writing them yourself a little bit, resolve and reject, and then looking at async await, how it makes our code look a little bit nicer, but also understanding that async await just makes this whole function a promise, and await is used to pull out values of promises while waiting for the promise to complete. Again, promises, before I finish, I'm just rambling. Promises are just objects that we're using to represent the state of our asynchronous code, because callbacks don't give us that option. All right, thanks so much for watching. Give a like and thumbs up if you like this video. Comment below if you want me to do any more of these really quick takes on, explaining complex subjects. Thanks for watching. We'll see you later.